Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Drop-In and Surf Show. My name is Rob Case, and I'm a surfing paddling technique coach located in Northern California. Today's episode is going to be all about swell. I think it was 2 episodes ago, we talked about wind and how wind helps in wave creation through wind speed, duration, and fetch. And wind helps in local wave and surface conditions in the direction and the speed and the duration. Well, I mentioned at the end of that episode that eventually we'll have to talk about swell, and we'll have to follow it up with swell, which is what is created from all that wind speed, duration, and fetch. And so that's what today's all about. So if you need a refresher on wind, just pause this episode, head over to that episode, and rewatch or re-listen that episode, because I'm going to reference a lot of wind-related terminology from that episode. It might just help just get a refresher. Now, we've also on past episodes discussed the importance of bathymetry, period, and swell direction when it comes to the waves that we ultimately end up surfing at our local shoreline. So this episode is actually squeezed kind of in between wind, which is like the creation, and the waves we surf and what happens when they actually hit the shoreline, with a bit of overlap on both. So in other words, wind creates swell that eventually makes it to the beach to create the waves that we love to surf. But not all swell is created equally. And so understanding the specifics of different types of swell and the characteristics and behavior of swell, it's important. It's important in determining how that swell turns up and turns into the waves we surf. Now, philosophically speaking, wind births swell, which then turns into a wave and then dies at the shoreline. So, that's the life cycle of a swell, from birth to death, right? Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to break that life cycle down to better understand swell. So for that, I've broken up this discussion into 4 parts, or the 4 stages of life, quote unquote. So there's creation, there's traveling, there's arrival, and there's conclusion. And I use conclusion because that just sounds a little bit better than death. So let's get into it. So swell creation, as we've discussed, when wind blows across the water surface, it creates waves by transferring energy to that water. And now these waves are initially formed by wind pushing against the surface and pushing against the surface and moving the surface upward. Okay, so then what happens is gravity, so it blows, pushes it up, and then gravity pushes it back down. It steps in to stabilize the water that has now been displaced by the wind. It pulls the water back down, creating this kind of this up and down motion that we see and that we feel. Now, this pull and push of the wind pushing up and gravity pushing it down keeps the water particles in motion, keeps it going, and that maintains the wave's energy as it travels away from the source. Okay, so gravity, gravity also ensures that swells can travel over long distances without losing much energy. So the force of gravity maintains that momentum of the swell as it moves along, right? Allowing it to journey across entire oceans, huge amounts of ocean, and eventually ends up breaking on the shoreline when the height of the swell to the depth that it's in, that height to depth requirement is met in order for it to then spill over and break. But before we jump too far ahead, let's hold there and just talk a little bit more about swell creation a little bit more. But I kind of gave you where we're going with this. But let's talk about swell creation. And going back to, you know, the keys. The keys here are wind speed, right? Duration, so how long it blows for, and fetch. Just like in the wind episode, right? So the stronger the wind up, the higher up you go on this scale, right? Stronger the wind, the more energy is transferred to that water surface, right? It blows onto this water surface. And if it's done for a long period of time, duration, more and more waves are created, and those capillary waves grow larger and larger. And then if it's done over a long distance or area, and fetch, if it's done over a long distance, this is done over a long distance, right? Then, and the fetch, gravity works more and more to smooth these waves into swell. Okay, so if you combined wind with gravity, those are really the true parents of swell. Now, remember, to create good swell production, generally the absolute minimum wind speed on the Beaufort scale for wind speed should be about a 6. So it's called a strong breeze. It's about 25 to 31 miles per hour. That's kind of in this zone here. This is in knots, but it's pretty close to knots, 21, 30, somewhere around here. Right? But really, you want to look for storms that have a 7 or above to produce really, really strong swell. Now, in addition, this wind speed needs to be combined with those two other factors, duration and fetch, to create consistent high-quality swell. The more you have of each of these factors, the better and bigger and more powerful the swell will be. But any certain combination of these factors will produce rideable waves, but the quality and power band will vary more when, for example, only 2 of the 3 factors are solid and the third is kind of so-so. So, for example, if you have fast winds like gale force or above, which is like the top part of this scale here, over a long duration, say 8 hours or more, over a long fetch, which is towards the right in nautical miles over here, say 10 nautical miles or more, it creates a good solid swell to surf when it arrives at our shoreline. So you're up in this area of swell, right? Now you could have, like I said, you could have 2 of the 3 be solid, and you could still get waves. Right? For example, a strong gale, 47 to 50 miles per hour, blowing for 12 hours, but only blowing the same direction for, say, 2 nautical miles. And you'll produce swell for sure. It'll be fun, but it may be short-lived or inconsistent when it arrives at your shoreline. So you're really looking for all 3 factors for the best swell event arriving at your shoreline. Now, once it arrives at your shoreline, the direction and refraction and local conditions play a huge role in the quality of the surf, which is like the peel angle, the surface conditions, so on and so forth. So I think at this point, I feel like we understand well how swell is created, right? So the next phase of a swell's life is traveling across a body of water where it's not feeling the ocean floor, right? So deep water. Before we go too deep into this phase of the life of a swell, we should probably take a quick moment to outline the key parts of a swell from a terminology point of view. So let's start defining swell in deep water versus shallow water. Okay, so deep water, and the easiest way to define this is to say that deep water swell, it's where the energy doesn't touch the ocean floor, whereas shallow water swell or waves, swell or waves, are where the energy does start to interact and touch the ocean floor. So there's a great importance of this distinction comes in the differences in the swell's behavior in deep water versus shallow water. Okay, so the technical difference of a shallow water wave is one that's traveling in water whose depth is less than half of the wavelength. So when that happens, the bottom substantially alters the characteristics of a wave. So deep water, Shallow water, the characteristics of the swell or the wave changes. Right? Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to know what the heck does wavelength mean. We have to understand the different parts of the wave next. Okay. So let's take a quick look. Here are the basic parts of a wave. We've got the crest, right, which is the high point of a wave. The trough is the low point of the wave. The wave height is the difference between the crest and the trough. That's the wave height, right? The wave length is then, therefore, the horizontal distance. So the wave height is the vertical distance between the trough and the crest, and the wave length is the horizontal distance between adjacent crests. Okay. Now, wave period, if we go back here, wave period is the time in seconds for a wave crest to traverse a distance equal to one wavelength. So just so that we don't screw this up, wavelength is in distance and wave period is in time. Okay. Another way of stating this is that the period of the wave is the time in seconds between time in seconds for two successive crests, 1 and 2, to pass a fixed point like a piling. Right, but the deep water or shallow water is not the only place you can kind of measure. You can measure wavelength, but that's just another way of thinking about it. So, waves in general, they're classified according to their period, which is the time between the two crests. So it's like a time version of what wavelength is. Okay, there is a direct relationship between wave period and wavelength. We just said that, right? What is wave period? It's the time it takes for two adjacent crests to pass a fixed point, right? It's the time. So obviously, if you have a longer wavelength, it takes longer for those two crests to pass that fixed point. Okay, so directly correlated, direct relationship. But wave height is independent of either. Okay, wave length depends on wave period, but height does not. A wave's height in deep water is related to the amount of energy that created the wave, right? So that's the wind speed, the fetch, and the duration. So remember, we're talking about deep water at this point, deep water. So wave height dependent on wind direction, duration, and fetch. Why that other podcast was so important. Okay. So now under ideal conditions, a swell is like a sine curve. It's actually a perfect sine, a pure sine wave can be produced. So wavelength in feet is equal to 5.12 times the square of the period in seconds. Okay, so a 1 second period would be 5.12 feet long from crest to crest. A 10-second period would be 512 feet long. Wave height, though not directly related to wavelength, was found to have a certain limit in relation to wavelength, meaning scientists found that wave height in deep water can't be greater than 1/7 of the wavelength, or else the crest will become unstable and tumble, which is basically it'll break in deep water. So the relationship between wave height and wavelength, which is this h over L here, right? It's called the wave steepness, right? And again, we're talking about deep water waves at this point, right? Now, the max wavelength for 1 unit high wave is 7 units long. That's that 1/7 ratio. Right? So the wave crest angle, which is the angle under the water where the crest is located, at this point where h over L is equal to 1/7, becomes 120 degrees. So that's kind of like the maximum crest angle that it can be before, that's the minimum crest angle that it can be before it starts to break. So once the crest angle reduces to less than 120 degrees, the wave's crest becomes unstable and breaks. So now that's common in both deep and shallow water. But let's talk really briefly about this relationship as the wave moves into shallow water now. Okay, and we'll come back more later when we talk about what happens when the swell arrives at the beach. But as depth decreases, the swell is known to peak up. We start to see it. We start to see that swell come toward us, which means that the height increases fairly rapidly based on the life of that wave, right? This whole time it's been kind of the same thing for thousands of miles, hundreds of miles, and then all of a sudden, quite rapidly, this thing starts to just stand right up, right? As soon as it starts touching the ocean floor. Now, not breaking, but it'll start to touch and feel it. So at the same time, the shallow water causes the wavelength to decrease. So the wavelength is a certain distance across, say 512 feet. And as it approaches, the wavelength actually starts to decrease. It gets less than 512 for that 10-second period swell wavelength, right? So now the result, it's a suddenly steepened wave, okay? Right? So we have something that starts to, get close to that critical kind of ratio of height to length, right? And so in a very short distance, the crest angle decreases below that 120 degrees, and the wave then breaks, okay? So when that happens, if the crest is moving more rapidly than the water below, it falls forward and the waveform collapses into that, turbulent mess that we know, right? That's that confusion. And that uses up most of the wave's energy after that first point. Now, so what we've learned so far with deep water, as long as the wavelength is greater than 1/7 of the wave height, the swell will just continue onward without becoming unstable. And then as it approaches shallow water and as it starts to feel the ocean floor, right, at that wave base, that energy starts to feel the ocean floor, the wave characteristics will also change. And they actually change quite rapidly, especially in comparison to the rest of the life of that swell. So it's therefore why we need to really understand the motion of water particles downward into the water column, into the water's depth, inside the wave, before we move on. Okay, really, really important we do that, so we better understand what's going on. So wave orbital motions decrease in size and flatten the deeper they are below the surface. So at the surface, the diameter of the orbit is equal to the height of the wave, which should make sense since that's the definition of wave height. This is the difference between the wave's crest and the trough. Now, below the surface, at 1/9, just 1/9 the wavelength, the wave particle diameters are half the original size of the original orbit, the surface orbit. So, for example, if a wave length is 81 feet across, if the wavelength is 81 feet across from crest to crest, right? That's approximately a 4-second swell. Okay. It's approximately a 4-second swell, 81 feet across. So if that's the case, if that's what we're looking at here, then how does this orbit kind of change as we go down? Okay. So the wave height is 4 feet, and subsequently the orbital diameter is 4 feet. Now, 9 feet, 1/9 of 81 feet of the wavelength, so 9 feet below the surface of the water, the particle orbits are only 2 feet in diameter. They're half of the 4 feet. Make sense? So at 2/9 below the water, so at 18 feet down below the surface, the orbital diameter is half of the half, or 1/4 of the original diameter, which in this case, if the original was 4 feet, we're talking about now it only being about 1 foot. Now, in addition to the kind of the diameter kind of shrinking to 1/4, now at about this depth, 2/9 of the wavelength, it starts to become more elliptical. It starts to flatten. So it's not quite 1 foot in diameter because it's an ellipse, but it's in that range. Okay. Now at 3/9 below the surface, and you think that's pretty far down, that's 25 feet down, right? It becomes 1/8 of the original size. It's a half of a half of a half. So now it's half a foot in diameter, but it's really flat. It's kind of like the energy is just kind of moving back and forth, right, at this stage. It's important to understand that just a little bit of energy is lost as you move deeper and deeper into the water, even though the movement of particles is negligible. Up until a depth half of the wavelength. So in the previous example, where we had an 81 foot wavelength, and here at 1/8 of the orbit side, we're 3/9 of that, so we're at about 27 feet down. Half of the wavelength is 40.5 feet. So the energy will still continue to resonate down, all the way down to a wave base in that example of about 40.5 feet of depth. So once you move deeper than that, the energy no longer present. Okay, so if you're scuba diving, for example, you're scuba diving way down below the wave base, you're not going to feel any motion of the ocean. If you're at the wave base, you'll feel kind of this back and forth. If you're a little bit higher, you'll feel this kind of circular, more orbital motion. That makes sense? If you've ever scuba dived, you would know, or free dove, you'd know what that felt like. Now, this is absolutely vital. Knowing how deep the energy goes based off of the wave period, which is also related to the wavelength. Extremely, extremely important. The energy the wave travels with is constantly transferred deep in the water down to a depth that is half the wavelength. That's what's important. Okay. All right. So I know that was a lot of terminology, but now that we know all the different parts of the swell, unfortunately, when I kind of describe the life cycle of a swell, right, I sort of lied to you. So the swells that actually arrive at your beach to become waves that we surf, and then they dissipate and they quote unquote die, they aren't actually the same swell that's created hundreds of thousands of miles away, hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away. It's actually not the same swell. Swells, as they travel across bodies of water in swell trains, they grow and they die constantly. Right? So the swell you see when you're about to surf, it's not the original swell. It's not the original wave, but rather descendants of the original swell that was created. I know it's kind of crazy. It's a little bit mind-blowing, but it'll make more sense when I explain a wave or swell train. Okay, so that's kind of our next stop. Okay, so let's go back first to the creation of swell in order to understand this. So as waves move out from under the winds that generate them, their character changes. The original wind waves are said to decay, meaning the crests become lower and more rounded and more symmetrical, and they move into groups of similar period and height. So they're like, hey, are you 4 feet? Are you about 15 seconds? Okay, cool. I want to hang with you. I'm going to go travel with you, right? And they start to organize into these common groups of swell period and swell height. So these wave trains, as they're called, are bundles of energy that advance through the ocean, okay? And even though an individual swell is actually moving at a speed that is the square root of gravity times wavelength divided by 2 pi, meaning it's going really fast, okay? So even though an individual swell is moving at that speed, the wave train itself is moving at about half that speed. Okay? So let's think about this. So they're moving in groups of similar swell period and height, right? And their form approaches that more so of a true sine wave. And so these are now called swell. And in this form, in this grouping, they can travel thousands of miles across deep water with very little energy loss. Very little energy loss and decay. It's pretty amazing. Looking at an individual wave train as the wave train moves into an undisturbed area, so like flat water in front of it, okay? As the leading swell approaches that, it must use some of its forward moving energy, its kinetic energy, to set new water particles orbiting, right? So it pushes in and it transfers energy to new wave particles to get them moving, okay? So what happens is that the leading wave and the leading waves are constantly disappearing from the front of the wave train. And then new waves, so one disappears and number 4 pops up in the back. So new waves kind of form at the back of the wave train. And because of that, the number of waves in a wave train and the total energy remain about the same as the group advances across the deep ocean. But again, the velocity of the group is reduced by about half of what an individual swell is moving at. Okay. So now, in terms of forecasting waves, like Surfline and those kinds of companies, they're really concerned not so much about an individual swell speed, but the swell speed of a wave train, right? The group velocity or the wave train's velocity. That's what's most important. And so since groups are usually, wave trains are usually broken up into similar height and period, it's pretty easy to actually kind of get that estimate. Now, here's the crazy thing. So remember when I told you that the waves we ultimately surf are the descendants of the swells that were created? Well, okay, now it should make a lot more sense. Why? The first wave of the wave train disappears while the last wave is now created, moving the entire group forward, but also with a constant of death and birth, death and rebirth. So remember, the golden rule of energy is that it can't be destroyed or created, but rather it is able to be transferred. And in the wave train, the energy is constantly being transferred as the entire wave train moves forward. And I kind of think of like a bike peloton of sorts, like the Tour de France in the long segments. Except that in this peloton, instead of the lead rider moving to the back of the peloton, back of the group, the lead rider completely drops out of the race. And a new rider all of a sudden comes in at the back. That's how I think about it. It's physics-wise, it doesn't work the same. Like the first wave isn't breaking any drag. It's just transferring energy, and then there's one popping up in the back. So now, as we begin to approach shallow water, where the depth of the water is less than half the wavelength, these waves start to feel the ocean floor. They feel the bottom, and they undergo some pretty radical changes in wavelength, which we've already talked about. It gets smaller. Velocity, everything slows down, actually. And direction can change as well. Woo-hoo-hoo. So exciting. So now we're at the arriving stage. We're not quite conclusion, but we're now at the arriving. Okay, the swells come in, it's been created, it's traveled, now it's arriving at our shoreline. The period determines the depth the wave energy begins to feel the ocean floor. The period, the time between the two crests, determines the depth at which the wave energy begins to feel the ocean floor. So, for example, I'll pull this up. A 4-second swell train. Remember, it could be a swell train or it can be an individual swell, but a swell train. 4 seconds between crests. Begins to feel the ocean floor at half of the wavelength. So the wavelength is about 82 feet. Half of that is it begins to feel the ocean floor when the depth is about 41 feet of depth. Now that's fairly shallow. I think at least here on the Pacific, on the west coast of California, 40 feet of depth is pretty close offshore. You can visually see that, right? And so this is where the swell starts to feel the ocean floor. It's not where the wave will break. Okay, it's just where it starts to feel the ocean floor. If we were to take a now look at a 12-second period, 12-second period is 737 feet across from crest to crest. It starts to feel the ocean floor at about 369 feet of depth. Okay, so that's much further offshore. Okay, and remember what happens when these swells start to feel the ocean floor. The wavelength actually shortens. Okay, and what else happens? The swell starts to slow down, or the swell train starts to slow down. And it could potentially change direction as well. Well, we're going to get to that in a second. Let's take a look at a 20-second swell period. It has a 2,048-foot wavelength. And it starts to feel the ocean floor at 1,024 feet. That is deep. Okay? So the characteristics of these swells are so vastly different. So vastly different. Now, once a swell begins feeling the ocean floor, its whole behavior changes. And it changes rapidly, especially in comparison to its quote-unquote life before it. Remember, it's descended, so it's not really its same life, but I think you get the point. It's very, very rapid in comparison to that. Now, to our own eyes, it doesn't look that rapid. You kind of see the lumps coming, and then what's rapid is when the wave breaks. But we're not going to get there yet. We're not quite there. Let's kind of firm up this understanding. Okay, so first, when the swell train begins feeling the ocean floor, it runs into friction, and the swell's velocity slows down. Okay, think about that. It starts to slow down because it's feeling the ocean floor. These energy particles are feeling, and it's like whoa, what's going on here? And this part's slowing down. Okay, and it slows the whole thing down. It slows the whole swell down. Okay, now the bottom slows first because it's interacting with the bottom first, while the crests, they keep going. Now, what happens then is that leads to a shortening, a decrease in the wavelength. Now, recall, once this happens, the wave is suddenly steepened. It's taller, right? But the crest angle, where's that one? Crest angle, nope, there it is. Crest angle, it still won't breach that 120 degrees yet, it won't go below that 120 degree requirement until the depth reaches a specific ratio. Now that ratio is when the depth is less than or equal to 1.28 times the height of the wave. So this is actually called the shallow water wave formula. Okay. The shallow water wave formula is here. So when the water depth for a 2-foot high wave to break, the water depth is 1.28 times the height of the wave. And that's true height wave from crest to trough. So at 2.56 feet of depth, this 2-foot wave begins to now tumble over. So this ratio, the depth to height of the wave, or the height to the depth of the wave, whatever you want to do the ratio, that ratio is what causes a wave to break. So in a very short distance, the crest angle does decrease below the 120 degrees, and the wave becomes unstable and breaks. The crest is moving more rapidly than the water below it. It falls forward, and the wave form collapses into its turbulent mess. Right? And that, again, uses up most of the energy right there. But before it reaches that ratio, the group of waves that have been traveling together, this train, right, with roughly the same period, roughly the same height, they begin to diffract and refract. Now, diffraction could happen without the swell even touching the bottom. So that could happen in deep water, right? Meaning that, like, if this is a deep water island offshore, greater than the required depth for a swell to begin feeling the ocean bottom, which is half the wavelength. So let's say that this island is deeper than half the wavelength of these waves. These wave trains could still turn. Okay, the island doesn't really like cause a clear wave shadowing here. In theory, if this wave train were to hit this island, this whole side of the leeward side of the island should have no waves at all, but there's usually waves. And this is why it's really important for engineers to understand this so they can build marinas that are protective or areas where a boat won't be affected by this, right? So what happens is there's more of a bending action of the swell around the deep water island. And it's possible that some of the bending is due to some refraction, like close to shore, where it's feeling the ocean floor. That's refraction. But diffraction is the main player in this instance. And what's really happening is as the wave passes this deep water island, some of the energy is propagated sideways as the wave crest spread out their energy as they pass around the edge of an obstacle or kind of any opening through any opening. So this is what happens when there are kind of wave shadows from offshore islands, like in Southern California. Southern California's Channel Islands, the Catalina Island, and the San Clemente Island, and that whole swell window. So diffraction happens a lot. So as the swell comes in, say from the northwest, yeah, there's some refraction close to shore at some of these islands, but there's diffraction that actually it bends. And so you can get bending that comes in towards Santa Barbara and bending that comes around. Now, there is also shadowing as well. And so there's shadowing along with the diffraction bending. And so that's why when you look at offshore buoys in this swell window, they have vastly different swell angles and directions than the inshore buoys, like in San Diego. So take a look. Grab one of like the Cortez Bank buoy and then go to like the Leucadia buoy. And you'll have totally different swell angles. And they're from the same swell originally. It's pretty wild. Now, refraction, in other words, refraction versus diffraction, refraction by contrast occurs because the wave's energy starts to feel the ocean floor, one segment of the swell line at a time, while the rest of the swell line is still in deeper water. So this part of the swell here starts to feel the ocean floor because this headland sticks out. But this swell out here keeps going. And so this whole thing starts to turn and bend in towards the shallow water, right? So the segment of the swell line that's in the shallow water, it slows down and it steepens. As the segment of the swell line that's still in deep water, it just keeps moving forward at its regular speed because it hasn't felt anything yet. And so this segment in shallow water is attracted now to more and more shallow water, and therefore it begins to bend toward more and more shallow water, causing the segment that's in deeper water to now bend in as well, slowly, until it too feels the shallower and shallower water and begins to move toward more shallow water, right? So you got shallow water, you got deep water, and as soon as a swell starts to feel the ocean floor, it's attracted to shallow water. That's the main thing you got to take away from this. So when this energy down here starts to feel shallow water, it's gonna start going toward it. It's so attracted to that, right? And because different segments of the wavefront are traveling at different depths of water, the crests now bend and wave direction constantly changes. It's the craziest thing. So this is a shot of like inshore refraction, but there's offshore refraction too that brings swell into that shallow area. So if you have really, really long period swell, you're going to have a lot of diffraction happening, and then you're going to have a lot of refraction early. So you could have something that's like a west swell coming into the SoCal swell window, and all of a sudden, by the time it gets to the inshore, it's actually more south swell. It doesn't mean that that swell came from Tahiti. It's just that it was such a long period and it had diffraction around these islands, and then it had refraction early because 20-second swell starts feeling the ocean floor at around 1,000 feet of depth, and it starts to refract way out here. And then once it gets really close to shore, it refracts even more. And so that's how you can have a swell bend 180 degrees. So, for example, in the Mentawais in Indonesia, you have Lance's Rights, which bends 180 degrees and goes back the other way. It's crazy. It's period, wave period. So amazing. So amazing. All right. Finishing it up. So the conclusion of a wave. As I mentioned, the waves we end up surfing aren't the original swell. They're descendants of the original swell, though. The waves disappear at the front of the swell train, and they regenerate at the back of the swell train. This movement continues on as it begins to touch the ocean floor at its required period to depth shallow water equation, and as the swell train refracts towards shallower and shallower water. Okay. But the waves will not break until the depth to height shallow water wave formula ratio is met, regardless of swell period. Swell period will help the swell turn and refract, but it won't actually break until this 1.28 times the height of the wave requirement is met. Right? This is when a wave will begin to shoal, which is a fancy wave for breaking, in a depth of water that's 1.28 times the height of the wave. So, for example, a 2-foot true height wave requires 2.56 feet of depth or shallower to shoal or to break. A 10-foot wave requires 12.8 feet of depth or shallower. Now, once the depth is met, the wave will begin to shoal. But the type of shoaling depends on how quickly that depth to height ratio is met and where the depth goes after the wave begins to shoal. So a crumbling wave or a tubing wave. Right? That all depends more so on how quickly the bathymetry depth changes. Okay, so now, for example, if we have here 10-foot high wave moving into shallow water, needs 12.8 feet of depth for it to shoal. Okay, and it begins to reach a depth of, say, 15 feet, 14 feet, 13.5 feet, 13.25 feet, 13 feet. The swell will begin to rise up, but it won't shoal until it reaches that 12.8 feet of depth. If it never reaches it, the swell will remain at that height, but not break. It'll just keep going. It'll be like a perfect foil wave. If it continues to now 2.9 feet, and then 2.8, and then 2.8, that's that requirement, and then 2.7 just right after it, and the slope of the depth getting shallower and shallower, the slope is low, meaning the progress to shallow water is slow, then that wave will shoal, it will break, but it won't go top to bottom. It'll kind of mush and crumble down. It'll not do that. It'll do more like that. It'll be mushy. If, on the other hand, we take that same 10-foot wave and the depth moves from 15 feet to 13 feet and then suddenly to 8 feet, just super sudden, right? Real quickly, 8 feet over here, and it went from 15, 13, and then boom, 8 feet. Somewhere along that curve, it hit the 12.8 requirement to break. But it goes much shallower quickly, causing the crest to continue to move forward as the bottom of the wave slows dramatically. And that's when we get that top to bottom barrel. It's more about the slope And this is why water depth plays the most critical role in the way a wave breaks, where it breaks, and how we set up to catch the wave. I'm constantly talking to clients about this. Understanding this concept that it's all about the water depth versus the wave height, that ratio, understanding that concept, it's critical to wave catching with ease. And quickly understanding surf breaks as well. Now, incorporating our understanding now of swell period with this depth to height ratio requirement, all of that understanding helps us even more. Right? When a long period swell begins to reach that height to depth ratio, the wavelength shortens rapidly and in a greater magnitude than a short period wave does. In a longer period swell, right, you have this wavelength that's starting at 1,000 feet, and then all of a sudden it gets shrunk really fast. That means that the wave height's going to go up really fast. Whereas with something that's not as long, it is going to shrink, it's going to decrease, but in terms of the magnitude, from going from 81 to say 60 feet wavelength versus 1,000 feet wavelength down to say 500 or 600 feet of wavelength, whatever the decrease is, the magnitude is much greater when it's longer period, right? And so with a greater magnitude than those short period waves, with a long period wave, the height jumps up and steepens rapidly. Again, it still has more to do with bottom bathymetry and the change of the bottom bathymetry. But when a swell or wavelength decreases rapidly, it causes the height to shoot up rapidly too. So it's twofold. You have something that's longer period shortening really rapidly, bringing the height up really rapidly before it breaks. And then the second side of it is when, this swell back here, when it's starting to feel that ocean floor, it's already felt it because it's long period versus short period where it might not even feel it until here. Now it hits its requirement to actually break, and boom, it throws over even more. Right? So it's twofold. At the end of the day, the depth to height requirement tells us where to sit, where to take off, and how the wave is going to break. It's this ratio. This is it. Boom, right there. That's the golden key right there. That's the ticket. Now the swell period lets us know whether a swell is going to bend in to that beach and whether it receives energy or not. Is it going to bend? Is it a north swell that's going to bend into a south-facing beach? Is it a south swell that's going to bend into a north-facing beach? Is it going to hit dead on? Is it going to have all the energy without any decay from having to bend? It tells us how powerful the swell is going to be. The swell period tells us how powerful the swell is going to be, especially if it doesn't have to bend at all, right? And when we finally select a wave to surf, know that it's merely a descendant of many iterations of a wave with similar height and period that began its energy hundreds of thousands of miles away, or hundreds or thousands of miles away, from wind speed, from duration, from fetch, and gravity. Right? The original wave had disappeared almost as quickly as it was created. And yet the energy lived on, traveling all the way until we get to use it to ride on top of the water. Isn't that awesome? Like that's the greatest. That's swell. That's creation, that's traveling, it's arriving, and that's conclusion. So I hope you learned something new. I hope it's going to help you get into some high quality waves. So in the meantime, I'll see you in the water.